The headlights appeared in my rearview mirror like twin moons rising on the horizon. At first, I thought nothing of it. Another traveler on this lonely stretch of highway, nothing more. But as the minutes ticked by and the lights grew neither distant nor close, a familiar unease began to creep up my spine. I'd left the city late, later than I should have. The important meeting I'd stayed for had run long, and by the time I hit the road, the sun had already dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deep purples and blues. Now, 2 hours into my drive, the world outside my windshield had faded to an inky black, broken only by the reach of my headlights and the occasional reflective road sign. The car behind me had appeared about 20 minutes ago, materializing out of the darkness like a ghost. I'd been grateful for the company at first. There was something comforting about knowing I wasn't entirely alone out here, with the forest pressed close to the road and the distance between towns stretched long. But now, as I checked my mirror for what felt like the 100th time, that comfort had long since evaporated. The car hadn't changed position once, maintaining a distance close enough that I could make out the distinctive shape of its grille, but far enough that the driver remained a shadow. I pressed down on the accelerator, watching as my speedometer crept up. 65, 70, 75. The white lines on the road blurred together, trees whipping past in a dark smear. For a moment, I thought I'd put some distance between us. Then the headlights surged forward, growing larger in my mirror. My heart rate spiked, and I felt my palms grow slick against the steering wheel. "Just past me already?" I muttered, easing over to the right to give them plenty of room. But the car didn't pass. It just hung there, a menacing presence at my back. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they were tired, using my taillights as a guide. Maybe their cruise control was set to match my speed perfectly. Maybe the what-ifs tumbled through my mind, each one less convincing than the last. I found myself longing for the smartphone I'd left charging on my nightstand, cursing my forgetfulness, what I wouldn't give for Google Maps right now, to know how far it was to the next town, the next gas station, anywhere with lights and people. A green mile marker flashed by, 117. I did some quick mental math. The last town I remembered passing was at mile marker 98. That meant at least another 30 miles to the next exit, assuming there even was a town there. I checked the mirror again. The headlights seemed closer now, looming large. I squinted, trying to make out any details of the car or driver, but all I could see was a dark mass and those piercing lights. My eyes flicked to the gas gauge. The needle hovered just below half a tank. Plenty to get me home, but not if I had to start driving evasively. The thought sent a chill through me. Evasively? From what? I was letting my imagination run wild. To calm myself, I reached over and turned on the radio. Static hissed from the speakers, punctuated by fragments of garbled voices and music. I spun the dial, searching for a clear station, but found nothing but noise. With a frustrated sigh, I clicked it off, plunging the car back into silence. The quiet only amplified my awareness of the vehicle behind me. I could hear the faint rumble of its engine now, a deep growl that seemed to fill the night. My eyes darted between the road ahead and the rear-view mirror, torn between the need to watch where I was going and the compulsion to keep tabs on my pursuer. Pursuer. The word echoed in my mind, and I felt a fresh wave of panic rising in my chest. Was that what this was? Was I being pursued? But why? What could they possibly want? I ran through the events of the day, wondering if I'd angered anyone, if there was some reason someone might be after me. But nothing came to mind. I was just a regular guy, heading home after a long day at work. There was no reason for anyone to be following me, unless the stories I'd heard on the news flashed through my mind. Carjackings, abductions, worse. I'd always dismissed them as things that happened to other people in other places. Not here, not to me. But now, alone on this dark highway with an unknown threat at my back, those stories felt all too real. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, knuckles turning white. My foot pressed harder on the accelerator, the engine whining as I pushed it to speeds it rarely saw. 80, 85, 90. The headlights kept pace. A bead of sweat rolled down my temple. I was breathing hard now, each exhale fogging the windshield slightly. I cranked up the AC, the rush of cold air doing little to calm my nerves. In the distance, I saw a sign approaching. As I drew closer, I could make out the words, "Rest area, 2 miles." My heart leapt. People, safety. I could pull in there, maybe find a state trooper or at least some other travelers. But as quickly as the hope had come, doubt followed. What if this was what they were waiting for? For me to stop, to make myself vulnerable? The rest area would be isolated, dark. If they meant me harm, it would be the perfect place to strike. I warred with myself as the sign grew closer, larger. To stop or not to stop, safety or danger. The decision loomed before me like the curve of the highway. At the last moment, I kept going, blowing past the exit. In my mirror, I saw the headlights hesitate for a fraction of a second at the turnoff before continuing after me. My blood ran cold. They weren't looking for the rest area. They were following me. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't my imagination. This was real. My mind raced, grasping for a plan. I couldn't keep driving forever. Eventually, I'd run out of gas or road. I needed to do something to shake them off somehow. Ahead, the highway curved to the right. As I approached the bend, a crazy idea struck me. It was dangerous, possibly suicidal, but it was all I had. I waited until I was almost at the curve, then suddenly hit the brakes hard. My seatbelt locked, the force throwing me forward against it. Behind me, I heard the screech of tires as the other car reacted. In that moment of confusion, I cranked the wheel to the left, cutting across the oncoming lane and onto the shoulder. My tires hit gravel, the car fishtailing wildly. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought I'd lose control. But then the tires found purchase, and I accelerated, driving parallel to the highway but in the opposite direction. In my rear-view mirror, I saw the other car overshoot the curve, its brake lights flaring red as the driver realized what had happened. I didn't wait to see what they'd do next. I floored it, gravel pinging against the undercarriage of my car as I raced along the shoulder. My headlights bounced wildly, illuminating flashes of scrubby grass and startled wildlife. I drove like that for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, my heart pounding in my ears. Finally, when I could no longer see any lights behind me, I slowed down, carefully making my way back onto the highway. As I merged onto the empty road, heading back the way I'd come, the adrenaline began to wear off. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel, and I felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in my throat. I'd done it. I'd escaped, but the relief was short-lived as new worries set in. Who were they? Why were they following me? Would they come after me again? The question swirled in my mind as I drove, jumping at every set of headlights I saw in the distance. It wasn't until I saw signs for the city that some of the tension finally began to ease from my shoulders. As the highway widened and streetlights began to appear, I allowed myself to breathe a little easier. But I knew one thing for certain. I'd never look at a night drive the same way again. The darkness beyond my headlights would always hold the potential for danger, the rearview mirror window to lurking threats. I made it home safely that night, but the experience left an indelible mark. To this day, whenever I drive at night and see headlights in my mirror, I feel that old familiar unease creep up my spine, and I wonder, just for a moment, if they're coming for me again. The pulsing blue on my phone's GPS was the only certainty in a sea of shadows. I squinted at the screen, then at the street ahead, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. This couldn't be right, but as the robotic voice instructed me to turn right in 100 feet, I realized with growing unease that this night was about to take a turn I never saw coming. It had started as a simple drive home from my sister's place 2 towns over. I'd stayed later than planned, our catch-up session stretching well past midnight. "You should stay the night," she'd insisted, but I waved off her concerns. I was a grown woman, after all. I could handle a little night driving. The first hour had been uneventful. Streetlights gave way to darker county roads, then back to the glow of small-town main streets. It was in one of these towns, Millbrook, according to the welcome sign I'd passed, that things started to go sideways. My GPS had confidently directed me to exit the main road, guiding me down increasingly narrow streets. At first, I didn't think much of it. These old towns often had weird layouts, shortcuts that only locals knew. But as I turned onto yet another side street, the houses grew sparse, replaced by shuttered storefronts and empty lots. I glanced at my phone again, double-checking the route. According to the blue line on the screen, I was right where I was supposed to be. But everything in me screamed that this was wrong. The street narrowed further, barely wide enough for my sedan. Potholes pocked the asphalt, forcing me to slow to a crawl. The few streetlights I passed flickered ominously, casting erratic shadows that seemed to dance at the edges of my vision. Turn left in 50 feet. My GPS chirped cheerfully. I peered ahead, seeing nothing but darkness where the street should continue. As I inched forward, my headlights revealed a narrow alley between 2 dilapidated buildings. My stomach clenched. There was no way this was part of my route home. I stopped the car, the engines idle unnaturally loud in the silent night. Fumbling with my phone, I tried to zoom out on the map to see where exactly I was and how I'd gotten so off track. But as I tapped the screen, a message popped up. No network connection. No, I muttered, holding the phone up to the window as if that would magically grant me a signal. But the bars remained stubbornly empty. A flicker of movement caught my eye. I looked up sharply, my breath catching in my throat. In the dim glow of a distant streetlight, I saw a figure emerge from the shadows of a doorway. Then another, and another. My heart began to race. I watched frozen, as the shadowy forms moved with an unsettling purpose, converging slowly but steadily in my direction. I needed to get out of here, now. I dropped my phone, my trembling hands fumbling for the gear shift. But as I moved to put the car in reverse, the engine sputtered and died. "No!" I cried, turning the key frantically. The engine wheezed, trying to turn over, but refused to catch. Each failed attempt sent a fresh wave of panic through me. The figures were closer now. I could make out the outlines of their bodies, hunched and shambling. Their faces remained hidden in shadow, but I could feel their eyes on me, predatory and hungry. I locked the doors, though the flimsy click felt like little protection against the encroaching threat. My mind raced, grasping for a plan, for any way out of this nightmare I'd unwittingly driven into. The sound of scraping metal made me jump. I whipped around to see a gaunt face pressed against my driver's side window, eyes gleaming in the darkness. A hand, fingers unnaturally long and thin, clawed at the glass. A scream built in my throat, but terror stole my voice. I scrambled across the center console, putting as much distance between myself and that horrible face as I could. More figures surrounded the car now. I could hear them, a cacophony of rasping breaths and low, guttural sounds that might have been words in some twisted language. Trapped and terrified, I did the only thing I could think of. I reached for my phone, praying that somehow, miraculously, I'd have signal. 1 bar. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. With shaking fingers, I dialed 911, holding the phone to my ear as if my life depended on it, because I realized with stark clarity it very well might. The line crackled, and for a heart-stopping moment, I thought the call hadn't gone through. Then, blessedly, a voice. 911, what's your emergency? Help me, I gasped, my voice barely above a whisper. I am trapped. There are people, things surrounding my car. I don't know where I am exactly, but I'm in Millbrook. Please, you have to send someone. Ma'am, try remain calm, the dispatcher said, her tone maddeningly even. Can you describe your location? I peered out the windshield, trying to make out any landmarks, any street signs. But all I could see were those awful figures, pressing closer, their hands now smearing the windows with God knows what. I don't know, I said, panic rising in my voice. It's a narrow street. There are old buildings. My GPS led me here, but now it's not working. Please, they're trying to get in. As if to emphasize my point, a loud thump resonated through the car. They were on the roof now, the metal groaning under their weight. We're dispatching units to your location now, the dispatcher assured me. Stay on the line. Can you tell me what these people look like? I swallowed hard, forcing myself to look at the creatures surrounding my car. In the dim light, I could make out more details now. Details I wished I couldn't see. They're wrong, I said, my voice shaking. Too thin. Their limbs are too long. And their faces. I trailed off, unable to find words for the grotesque features pressed against my windows. A crack spiderwebbed across the passenger side window. They were breaking in. Oh, God, I whimpered. They're getting through the glass. Please hurry. Ma'am, listen to me, the dispatcher said, her voice taking on a new urgency. I need you to stay as quiet as possible. Our officers are en route, but it's crucial that you don't draw attention to yourself. I nodded, forgetting for a moment that she couldn't see me. I clamped a hand over my mouth, trying to muffle the sobs that threatened to escape. The cracking glass grew louder. I could hear it giving way, piece by piece. My eyes darted around the car's interior, searching desperately for anything I could use as a weapon. But there was nothing. I was utterly defenseless. A new sound cut through the night. Sirens, distant but growing closer. Hope surged within me, giving me strength I didn't know I had. The creatures heard it too. Their assault on my car intensified, as if they knew their time was running out. The roof dented inward with a sickening crunch. Clawed hands scrabbled at the edges of the windows, seeking purchase. They're almost here. The dispatcher's voice came through the phone, steady and reassuring. Just hold on a little longer. The sirens grew louder, and suddenly the narrow street was bathed in flashing red and blue lights. I saw the creatures recoil, shrinking back from the sudden brightness. Police, step away from the vehicle. The authoritative shout was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard. I watched through tear-blurred eyes as uniformed officers swarmed the area, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The creatures scattered, melting into the shadows with inhuman speed. In moments, they were gone, leaving no trace of their presence save for the damage to my car and the racing of my heart. A knock on my window made me flinch, but the kind face of a police officer quickly put me at ease. Ma'am, are you all right? Can you open the door? With trembling hands, I unlocked the door. The officer helped me out, supporting me as my legs threatened to give way. You're safe now, he assured me, wrapping a shock blanket around my shoulders. Can you tell us what happened? I opened my mouth to speak, but found I had no words to describe the horror I'd just experienced. How could I explain the impossible things I'd seen? Would they even believe me? As dawn broke over Millbrook, painting the sky in soft pinks and golds, I sat in the back of an ambulance, clutching a cup of lukewarm coffee. The police had found no trace of my attackers, no evidence beyond the damage to my car. I watched as a tow truck hooked up my vehicle, knowing I'd never feel safe behind its wheel again. My phone, now with full signal, buzzed with worried messages from my sister. As I prepared to give my statement, I knew one thing for certain. I would never again blindly trust a GPS. Some roads, I realized, are better left untraveled, and some turns should never be taken, especially not in the dead of night, when shadows come alive and the familiar world twists into something terrifyingly unknown. The first drop of rain hit my windshield like a warning shot. Within seconds, the sky opened up, unleashing a deluge that reduced the world beyond my headlights to a gray blur. As I leaned forward, squinting to make out the road, I never imagined that my next decision would plunge me into a nightmare far darker than any storm. I'd been driving for hours, making my way back from a business conference 2 states over. The forecast had promised clear skies, so I'd opted for the scenic route home, a winding road that cut through miles of dense forest. It was beautiful by day, but as night fell and the rain began, that beauty twisted into something more sinister. My wipers fought a losing battle against the downpour, and I found myself slowing to a crawl. Every flash of lightning illuminated a landscape of gnarled trees and slick asphalt, their twisted shapes seeming to reach for my car as I passed. It was in one of these brief moments of illumination that I saw him, a lone figure standing at the roadside, thumb outstretched. My foot instinctively moved to the brake before my brain could catch up. I'd always been taught never to pick up hitchhikers, especially not on a night like this. But as I drew closer, I could see he was soaked to the bone, his clothes clinging to a thin frame. Against my better judgment, I pulled over. The man hurried to my passenger side door, and I leaned over to unlock it. As he slid into the seat, I was hit by the smell of wet clothes and something else, something I couldn't quite place. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't think anyone would stop in this weather. I nodded, trying to get a good look at him in the dim interior light. He was younger than I'd initially thought, probably in his early 20s. His hair was plastered to his forehead, water dripping down a face that seemed too pale, too gaunt. "Where are you headed?" I asked, pulling back onto the road. "Just up ahead," he replied vaguely, gesturing forward. "There's a turnoff in about 10 miles. I can direct you from there." I frowned slightly but nodded. 10 miles wasn't too far out of my way, and I couldn't in good conscience leave him out in this storm. As we drove, I tried to make conversation, to dispel the odd tension that seemed to fill the car. "So, what brings you out here on a night like this?" He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice had an edge to it that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Sometimes, life takes unexpected turns. You end up places you never thought you'd be." I swallowed hard, suddenly very aware of how alone we were on this dark, empty road. "I suppose that's true," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But usually those turns don't leave you hitchhiking in a storm." He laughed, a sound devoid of any real mirth. "You'd be surprised." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic swish of the wipers and the drumming of rain on the roof. I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter, my eyes darting between the road ahead and my strange passenger. In the flashes of passing lightning, I caught glimpses of him, his fingers tapping an erratic rhythm on his knee, his eyes reflecting an unsettling gleam. With each mile that passed, the feeling that I'd made a terrible mistake grew stronger. "It should be coming up soon," he said suddenly, leaning forward in his seat. "The turn off." I nodded, relief washing over me at the thought of dropping him off and continuing on my way. But as I scanned the roadside, I saw no sign of any upcoming turns. "Are you sure?" I asked. "I don't see anything." "It's easy to miss," he assured me. "Just keep an eye out. It'll be on the right." Another mile passed, then another. Still no turn-off. The unease in my stomach turned to full-blown anxiety. I chanced to glance at my passenger, only to find him staring at me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. "I think," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "that we might have missed your turn. Maybe we should head back dash." "No," he snapped, his sudden vehemence making me flinch. "It's just up ahead. Keep driving." My heart was pounding now, every instinct screaming at me to stop the car, to get this man out. But we were miles from anywhere, surrounded by nothing but dark forest and pounding rain. If he meant me harm, I was in no position to defend myself. So I drove on, each second stretching into an eternity of dread. It was then that I saw it, a glint of something metallic in his hand. My breath caught in my throat as I realized he was holding a knife, its blade catching the dim light from the dashboard. "Pull over," he said, his voice low and dangerous. My mind raced, searching desperately for a way out of this nightmare. I thought about flooring it, trying to outrun him somehow, but the rain-slicked roads made that a deadly gamble. "Listen," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "I don't want any trouble. I can give you my wallet, my phone, whatever you want." "Just Ash, I said pull over," he shouted, brandishing the knife. In that moment of distraction, I saw my chance. With a silent prayer, I yanked the steering wheel hard to the right. The car fishtailed wildly, tires screeching against wet asphalt. My passenger was thrown against the door, the knife clattering to the floor. For a terrifying second, I thought we would flip, but somehow I managed to bring us to a skidding halt on the shoulder of the road. Before he could recover, I fumbled with my seatbelt and threw myself out of the car. The rain was still coming down in sheets, instantly soaking me to the skin. But I didn't care. All that mattered was getting away. I ran, my feet slipping on the muddy ground, branches whipping at my face as I plunged into the forest. Behind me, I could hear shouting, the sound of pursuit. My lungs burned as I pushed myself harder, deeper into the woods. The darkness was almost complete here, broken only by occasional flashes of lightning that threw twisted shadows across my path. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that primal flight. Eventually, I found myself at the base of a large tree, its trunk wider than I could wrap my arms around. Gasping for breath, I pressed myself against its rough bark, straining to hear over the pounding of rain and my own thundering heartbeat. Nothing. No sound of pursuit, no angry shouts. Just a relentless storm. As the adrenaline began to ebb, the reality of my situation set in. I was lost in an unfamiliar forest in the middle of a storm, with no idea which direction would lead me back to the road. And somewhere out there, a man with a knife was looking for me. I slid down the trunk of the tree, huddling at its base as sobs racked my body. How had a simple act of kindness turned into this nightmare? As if in answer, a bolt of lightning split the sky, followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. In that brief illumination, I saw something that made my blood freeze. A figure, standing motionless among the trees, not 20 feet away. I clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle a scream, pressing myself harder against the tree as if I could somehow melt into its bark. The darkness that followed the lightning seemed absolute, and I strained my eyes, desperate to see if the figure was moving, approaching. Another flash, and he was gone. I didn't wait to see if he'd reappear. I scrambled to my feet and ran again, blindly crashing through underbrush, branches scratching at my arms and face. I had no plan, no destination. My only thought was to put as much distance between myself and that ghostly figure as possible. It was pure luck that led me back to the road. I burst out of the tree lean, gasping and mud-splattered, to find myself standing on asphalt. In the distance, I could see headlights approaching. Relief flooded through me as I waved my arms frantically, praying that the driver would see me through the rain. As the car slowed to a stop, I nearly wept with gratitude. An older couple peered out at me with concern as I explained, through chattering teeth, that I'd run into some trouble and needed help. They didn't ask for details, just ushered me into their warm car and promised to take me to the nearest police station. As we drove away, I kept looking back, half expecting to see my attacker emerge from the woods. But there was nothing but rain and darkness. At the police station, I gave my statement, watched as they sent out patrols to search for the man in my abandoned car. They found the car, but of my attacker, there was no trace. In the days and weeks that followed, I replayed that night in my mind countless times. The decision to stop, the growing unease, the terrifying chase through the woods. I installed extra locks on my doors, jumped at unexpected sounds, and never again drove that road at night. But more than anything, I was left with a chilling realization. Sometimes, the real monsters aren't the strangers we're warned about as children. Sometimes, they're the ones we invite in, cloaked in the guise of someone in need. And in that moment of compassion, we unknowingly open the door to a darkness we can never truly escape. The face in my rearview mirror wasn't mine. Pale, gaunt, with eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. It appeared for just a split second before vanishing. I blinked hard, convinced my tired mind was playing tricks on me. But as I continued down the lonely stretch of highway, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. It had been a long day at the office, the kind where the hours blur together in a haze of meetings and deadlines, and before you know it, the sun has long since set. I'd promised my wife I'd be home for dinner, but as I finally shut down my computer and grabbed my keys, I knew I was going to be at least 2 hours late. The first leg of my drive home was uneventful. City streets gave way to suburbs, then to the more rural outskirts. Traffic thinned until I was often the only car on the road for miles at a time. It was peaceful in a way. Just me, my thoughts, and the gentle hum of tires on asphalt. That peace was shattered the moment I saw that face. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Lack of sleep, stress from work, maybe even the start of a migraine. All perfectly logical explanations for seeing something that couldn't possibly be there. But then I saw it again. This time, the face lingered a moment longer, long enough for me to make out more details. Sunken cheeks, cracked, dry lips, and those eyes, they seemed to bore into me, even through the mirror. I jerked my gaze back to the road, my heart pounding. This was insane. There was no one in my back seat. I would have noticed someone getting in. I would have heard them, right? Against my better judgment, I turned to look over my shoulder. The back seat was empty, just as I knew it would be. Nothing but shadows and the vague shapes of papers I'd left scattered there earlier in the week. I let out a shaky breath, turning back to face the road. Get it together, I muttered to myself. You're letting your imagination run wild. But even as I said the words, I couldn't help but check the rearview mirror again. Nothing, just the dark road behind me, illuminated by my taillights. I forced myself to focus on driving. 1 mile marker after another slipped by as I tried to lose myself in the monotony of the journey. But I couldn't relax. My eyes kept darting to the mirror, half expecting, half dreading to see that face again. It was during one of these nervous glances that I nearly missed my turn. I cursed, braking harder than necessary and swerving onto the exit ramp. As I slowed to a stop at the red light at the end of the ramp, I took a deep breath, trying to calm my frayed nerves. That's when I heard it, a soft tapping sound coming from behind me. I froze, my hand hovering over the gear shift. Slowly, painfully slowly, I raised my eyes to the rearview mirror. There it was, the face. No longer just a fleeting glimpse, but fully formed and undeniably real. It smiled at me, a terrible, knowing smile that made my blood run cold. A scream built in my throat, but before I could release it, the light turned green. The car behind me honked impatiently, snapping me out of my terrified trance. I hit the gas, tires squealing as I accelerated through the intersection. My mind raced as fast as my car. This couldn't be happening. It wasn't possible. And yet, every time I dared to look in the mirror, those eyes were there, watching me. I fumbled for my phone, nearly dropping it in my panic. I needed to call someone, anyone. But as I looked at the screen, my heart sank. No signal. Of course. This stretch of road was notorious for its dead zones. The tapping came again, louder this time. It seemed to be coming from the rear passenger window. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help myself. In the side mirror, I could see a hand, pale and skeletal, rapping its knuckles against the glass. That was it. Whatever this thing was, hallucination or horror beyond imagining, I couldn't stay in the car with it. At the next crossroad, I made a sharp turn, tires screeching in protest. I spotted a gas station up ahead. its fluorescent lights a beacon of hope in the darkness. I pulled into the lot, brakes squealing as I came to an abrupt stop next to a pump. Without even turning off the engine, I flung open my door and practically fell out of the car. The cool night air hit me like a slap to the face, grounding me in reality. I stood there for a moment, gulping in deep breaths, before finally working up the courage to look back at my car. Empty. The back seat was completely empty. On shaky legs, I walked around the vehicle, peering in through each window. There was no sign of the nightmarish face, no evidence of the skeletal hand. Just my ordinary, slightly messy car. "You okay there, mister?" I nearly jumped out of my skin at the sound of the attendant's voice. He was an older man, looking at me with a mixture of concern and wariness. "Ah, yes," I managed to stammer out. "Just thought I saw something in my back seat. Must have been a trick of the light." He nodded slowly, clearly not entirely convinced. "Want me to take a look for you? Sometimes we get animals crawling into cars around here. Possums, raccoons, that sort of thing." Part of me wanted to say yes, to have someone else confirm that there was nothing supernatural going on. But a larger part was terrified of what he might find. Or worse, what he might not find, leaving me to question my sanity even further. "No, thank you," I said, forcing a smile. "I'm sure it was nothing, but since I'm here, I might as well fill up." The simple act of pumping gas helped calm my nerves. It was so mundane, so normal, that it began to make the whole experience feel like a bad dream. By the time I finished and went inside to pay, I had almost convinced myself that's all it had been, a vivid hallucination brought on by exhaustion and an overactive imagination. As I walked back to my car, keys in hand, I felt a sense of determination. I would get home, kiss my wife, take a long hot shower, and put this whole bizarre episode behind me. I opened the driver's side door and started to slide in. That's when I saw it. A single, long white hair on the back seat. A hair that definitely hadn't been there before. My blood turned to ice in my veins. With trembling fingers, I reached out and picked it up. It was real, tangible, proof that I wasn't going crazy. But if I wasn't going crazy, then that meant the tapping started again, this time on the windshield. I looked up, and there it was, the face. No longer inside the car, but pressing against the glass from the outside, its features distorted into a grotesque parody of a human visage. I scrambled backwards, nearly tripping over my own feet in my haste to get away. The attendant, hearing my panicked gasps, came running out of the station. "What's wrong?" he called out. "What do you see?" I pointed at the windshield, words failing me. But as the attendant's gaze followed my gesture, his expression changed from concern to confusion. "There's nothing there, sir," he said slowly, as if speaking to a child. "Are you sure you're all right to drive?" I looked back at my car. The face was gone. Again, I stood there, the white hair still clutched in my fist, my mind reeling. I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. The attendant sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Listen, why don't you come inside? I'll make you a cup of coffee, and we can call someone to come get you. You shouldn't be driving in this state." His words made sense. They were the rational, responsible thing to do. But as I stood there, staring at my car, I knew I couldn't stay. Whatever was happening, whatever was following me, I couldn't risk bringing it here. Couldn't risk it hurting anyone else. "Thank you," I said, straightening up and doing my best to look composed. "But I'll be fine. Home isn't far now." Before he could protest, I got back in my car and started the engine. As I pulled out of the gas station, I could see the attendant in my rearview mirror, watching me go with a worried expression. The rearview mirror. I couldn't help but look at it again as I merged back onto the highway. For now, it showed nothing but the road behind me. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that this wasn't over. Whatever entity had attached itself to me, whatever nightmare had somehow crossed over into reality, it wasn't done with me yet. As I drove into the night, every shadow on the road seemed to reach for my car, and every reflective surface held the potential for that terrible face to reappear. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white with tension. The white hair lay on the passenger seat, a constant reminder that I wasn't imagining things. I was in real danger from something I couldn't begin to understand. All I knew was that I had to get home, had to warn my wife, had to figure out how to protect ourselves. Because now, the darkness held more than just the absence of light. It held a presence, a malevolent force that had set its sights on me. And as I sped through the night, constantly checking my mirrors, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much longer, much darker journey. The muffled thumps from the trunk of the car pierced the silence of a deserted rest stop. I froze, my hand on the door handle of the restroom, as the sound registered. In that moment, I knew my quiet night drive had just taken a turn into something far more sinister. It had been a long day on the road. I'd left my hometown early that morning, determined to cover as much ground as possible on my cross-country move. As night fell, fatigue began to set in, my eyelids growing heavy with each passing mile. When I saw the sign for the rest stop, it felt like a godsend. The place was eerily quiet when I pulled in, my headlights cutting through the darkness to reveal a small, utilitarian building and a handful of parking spots. Only one other car occupied the lot, a nondescript sedan parked in the far corner, away from the lights. I didn't think much of it at first. It wasn't unusual to see other travelers at these stops, even late at night. I parked a few spaces away, stretched as I got out of my car, and headed for the restroom. That's when I heard it. The sound was faint at first, barely audible over the ambient noise of crickets and distant highway traffic. But as I paused, it came again, a distinct thumping, followed by what sounded like a muffled cry. My heart began to race. I told myself it could be anything. Maybe someone had locked their keys in their trunk, or an animal had somehow gotten trapped. But deep down, I knew those explanations rang hollow. I stood there, frozen in indecision. Every instinct screamed at me to get back in my car and drive away, to pretend I'd never heard anything. But could I live with myself if I did that? If there was someone in trouble, someone who needed help? Swallowing hard, I took a tentative step towards the other car. The sounds grew more distinct as I approached, definitely human, definitely distressed. I pulled out my phone, ready to call 911, only to see the dreaded no service message on my screen. Of course, these remote rest stops were notorious for their lack of cell coverage. I was about 15 feet from the car when its headlights suddenly flashed on, bathing me in harsh white light. I threw up a hand to shield my eyes, momentarily blinded. "Hey!" I called out, my voice sounding thin and afraid even to my own ears. "Is everything okay over there?" Silence. The thumping had stopped the moment the lights came on. I squinted, trying to make out any movement inside the car, but the glare of the headlights made it impossible. A bead of sweat rolled down my back despite the cool night air. "Look, I heard some noise," I continued, taking another hesitant step forward. "If someone's in trouble, I can help. Or I can leave right now and pretend I didn't hear anything. Just give me a sign or something." The driver's side door creaked open. I tensed, ready to run if needed. A figure emerged slowly, backlit by the headlights, so that I could only make out a silhouette. "Everything's fine," a man's voice said, low and controlled. "You should go now." But even as he spoke, I heard it again, a muffled cry from the trunk, followed by a thump that shook the whole car. "I don't think it is fine," I said, surprised at myself at the steadiness in my voice. "I'm going to need you to open that trunk." The man took a step towards me. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his features still hidden in shadow. I said, "Everything's fine. This doesn't concern you. Leave now." My mouth went dry. I was acutely aware of how isolated we were, how easily things could go very wrong for me. But I also couldn't shake the thought of whoever was trapped in that trunk, scared and alone. "I can't do that," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Not until I know what's going on here." The man moved with startling speed. One moment he was by his car. The next he was rushing towards me. I stumbled backwards, nearly losing my footing on the uneven pavement. Just as I thought he was going to grab me, a new sound cut through the night. Sirens, growing rapidly louder. The man froze, his head whipping towards the sound. I used his moment of distraction to put more distance between us, my back now pressed against my own car. Red and blue lights appeared on the horizon, growing brighter by the second. The man cursed under his breath, then turned and ran back to his vehicle. The engine roared to life as he threw it into gear. I watched, heart pounding, as he peeled out of the parking lot, gravel spraying from his tires. He fishtailed onto the highway, accelerating rapidly into the night. The police car, a highway patrol vehicle, pulled into the rest stop moments later. An officer stepped out, his hand resting cautiously on his holstered weapon. "Are you all right?" he called out to me. "We got a 911 call about a disturbance at this location." I nodded, still shaken. "I'm okay, but there's someone in trouble. The car that just left, there was someone trapped in the trunk. I heard them." The officer's expression hardened. He radioed in the situation, providing a description of the vehicle and its direction of travel. Within moments, I could hear more sirens in the distance. As the officer took my statement, the full weight of what had just happened began to sink in. I'd stumbled into something dark and dangerous, something that could have easily cost me my life, but I'd also potentially saved someone else's. The rest of the night passed in a blur of questions, statements, and cups of mediocre vending machine coffee. It wasn't until the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn that I was finally cleared to leave. As I got back into my car, exhausted but wired on adrenaline and caffeine, I couldn't stop thinking about the person in the trunk. Had the police caught up to the car? Had they been rescued? Or were they still out there somewhere, trapped and afraid? I pulled out of the rest stop, merging onto the nearly empty highway. The rising sun painted the sky in soft pinks and oranges, a beautiful sight that felt at odds with the darkness of the night's events. My phone buzzed. Service had finally returned. I had a dozen missed calls and messages from friends and family, all wondering why I hadn't checked in. I had to call them soon to reassure them I was okay. But how could I explain what had happened? How could I put into words the fear, the uncertainty, the weight of the choice I'd made? As I drove, my mind kept replaying those moments at the rest stop, the sound of thumping from the trunk, the man's silhouette emerging from the car, the rush of relief when I heard those sirens. I realized that life could change in an instant. One moment you're on a routine drive, and the next you're faced with a choice that could have life or death consequences. It was a sobering thought, but I also felt something else, something that surprised me, a sense of pride. When faced with a difficult and dangerous situation, I hadn't turned away. I'd stood my ground, even when every instinct told me to run. I didn't know what would happen next. The police had my contact information. They'd said they might need to follow up with more questions. There was a possibility I'd have to testify if they caught the man and brought him to trial. The thought made me nervous, but I knew I'd do it if asked, because someone out there had needed help, and I'd been there to raise the alarm. In a world that often felt chaotic and uncaring, that felt like something worth holding on to. As I continued down the highway, the events of the night slowly receding in my rearview mirror, I made a silent promise to myself. I would never again take a simple journey for granted. I would remain aware, remain ready to help if needed, because you never know when a routine stop might become something more, when you might be called upon to make a difference in someone's life. The road stretched out before me, full of possibilities and potential dangers. But for the first time since I'd left home, I felt truly awake, truly alive. Whatever came next, I knew I was ready to face it.